This is The World This Weekend. Good evening, I'm Stephanie Skandaris. Tonight, Vladimir Putin prepares to welcome a potential ally, China's President Xi Jinping, who claims he's on a peacekeeping mission. Also tonight, Donald Trump continues rallying his supporters as his legal troubles intensify.
I hope that America has learned from what has happened in the past, and I hope whatever happens next week, we just have a very peaceful set of events.
And later in the show,
earn free flights with the Air Miles program.
Once flying high, now the air has been let out of Air Miles.
With the trajectory that the program has been on over the past year or so, it was probably going to be a matter of time until something like this happened.
We look at whether Air Miles can thrive again. That's coming up. But first, a broker of peace for the war in Ukraine. Beijing says that's the role President Xi Jinping will play in a 3-day visit to Moscow that starts tomorrow. But the definition of that peace depends on who's being asked. U.S. officials warn Xi could be on the cusp of supplying his Russian counterpart with weapons for the war. It comes as Vladimir Putin makes his closest visit to the front lines since the full-scale invasion began. Philip Lishenok reports.
Video shows Vladimir Putin touring the ravaged eastern city of Mariupol in the dark, chatting with residents and taking a tour of a newly built apartment building. Mariupol was a symbol of Ukrainian defiance. The city fell after a brutal 3-month siege. It's also the site of suspected Russian war crimes, including the bombing of a maternity hospital and the illegal deportation of Ukrainian children, which the International Criminal Court indicted Putin for this week. Wesley Wark is an international affairs expert with the Center for International Governance and Innovation. He said visiting the city now sends a message.
It has to be read absolutely as a direct response, a kind of thumbing of the nose to international law and the international community. And doing so, I would say, in a kind of macabre fashion.
Putin's tour of Mariupol and his earlier visit to Crimea also comes before a summit with Chinese President Xi Jinping, his first visit to Moscow since the start of Russia's invasion. Beijing hasn't vocally supported Russia throughout the war and publicly claims to be a neutral party, but economic and political ties between the two nations are steadily growing. Next week, Western allies expect Putin to ask China to supply weapons for the war. Andrew Rasoulis is with the Canadian Global Affairs Institute.
The Chinese would give those weapons, in my opinion, only if they were essential to prevent a Russian defeat. The Chinese want a no winners, no losers situation here.
Today, Canada's Department of National Defence released video of Leopard 2 tanks being loaded onto a military transport bound for Ukraine. Rasoulis says the Ukrainians urgently need to make gains to change the momentum of the war.
Right now, we're in a relatively strategic stalemate, and we are expecting a major offensive to be in late April, early May.
Rasoulis says what happens on the battlefield will weigh heavily on behind-the-scenes diplomatic efforts. Meanwhile, Putin says Russia has big hopes for Xi's visit. Even if Beijing stops short of supplying weapons to Moscow, the visit itself challenges efforts by the West to isolate Russia from the international community. Philip Lishenok, CBC News, Toronto.
At a time when geopolitics are gripping the world stage, U.S. President Joe Biden's visit to Canada on Thursday comes at a crucial moment. As both nations grapple with spy balloons and foreign interference, security is what's expected to dominate the agenda. Marina von Stackelberg has more from Ottawa.
A lot has happened in the world in the last couple of years since the Biden administration came in.
Kirsten Hillman is Canada's ambassador to the United States. She says President Joe Biden and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau meet often on the international stage. But this one-on-one visit is a chance to focus on their own relationship.
Of course, we'll talk about the situations that are existing in the world and how we're working together all over the world. But we'll also focus on how we are, sources of strength for each other.
It's almost dangerous to try and predict what the president and the prime minister talk about.
David Cohen is the U.S. ambassador to Canada.
I think defense will be on the agenda. I think the war in Ukraine will be on the agenda.
Something Cohen says both countries agree on, Canada needs to spend more on defense. Ottawa is buying new fighter jets and working to modernize NORAD. It's an agreement from both countries to watch and protect the skies above them. Hillman says its importance was recently highlighted when NORAD detected and tracked a Chinese surveillance balloon over North American airspace, which was then shot down by a U.S. fighter jet.
I was quite happy to see the degree to which American media and Americans were thinking about NORAD in a way that I hadn't seen for a while.
You get an hour and a half. The president comes in, he wants to talk about Russia, China, Ukraine. He'll probably raise Haiti.
Colin Robertson, a former Canadian diplomat and fellow with the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, says the U.S. continues to look to Canada to lead efforts to stabilize the worsening situation in Haiti.
It will come up, and I think the response of the Prime Minister will be, we simply haven't got the capacity.
Robertson says while Biden will want to focus on defense and security, Trudeau will be keen to talk trade and economics.
The U.S. does tend to set the agenda, but successful prime ministers are able to turn that around to serve Canadian interests as well. And one of the arguments we use with the Americans when we have disagreements is to point out to them, gosh, if you can't get along with your closest neighbor and best friend, how can you help to manage the world?
Robertson points out this country's economy relies heavily on its southern neighbor. 3/4 of Canada's exports go to the United States. So while the relationship between the two countries is mutually beneficial, it is far from balanced. Marina von Stackelberg, CBC News, Ottawa.
The Manhattan District Attorney investigating Donald Trump says his office will not be intimidated. Alan Bragg made the comments in an internal staff memo this weekend. Bragg has been under fire from the former U.S. president after Trump claimed he'll be arrested this week. Here's Katie Simpson with all the reaction.
With a crowd of thousands cheering him on, Donald Trump strode confidently across an arena floor on his way to his seat to watch a college wrestling championship. If the former president is worried about an imminent arrest, he's not showing it. Just hours after making the bombshell prediction online, he showed up as planned for the tournament in Tulsa, Oklahoma. As he watched the matchups, a much larger battle kicked off in the political arena.
The idea of indicting a former president of the United States is deeply troubling to me, as it is to tens of millions of Americans.
Republicans of all stripes lined up behind Trump, including Mike Pence, the former vice president who hopes to challenge Trump to be the party's next presidential nominee. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy vowed to use his congressional powers to investigate the prosecutors linked to this case, while the Republican governor of New Hampshire, Chris Sununu, says when Trump has faced legal trouble before, it energizes his supporters.
I think it's building a lot of sympathy for the former president.
Trump's advisors say he was only speculating when he claimed he would be charged in connection to a hush money scheme to keep his alleged affair with porn star Stormy Daniels a secret. On his social media platform, he has since made repeated calls for protests.
I hope that America has learned from what has happened in the past, and I hope whatever happens next week, we just have a very peaceful set of events.
Gary Cohn, a former Trump advisor, says he's not expecting a repeat of January 6th.
So you're not worried about...
John Kirby, with the National Security Council, says there's no specific threat at this moment.
I'm not aware of any indications that we're preparing for that kind of activity.
This is just one of Trump's legal issues. Prosecutors in Georgia are still considering charges in connection to efforts to overturn election results. Federal investigators are looking at Trump's role in the Capitol attack. And then there is the classified documents saga. If you ask his supporters, it all points to a witch hunt.
He does not need to go to jail over a bunch of people lying. So it just infuriates me. He is the most godly, the most wonderful president that we've ever had.
This is the political support Trump wants, hoping it remains strong as his legal troubles intensify. Katie Simpson, CBC News, Washington.
In Montreal, fire officials say 7 people are still missing after a blaze tore through a historic building earlier this week. Construction crews have been dismantling the structure to make it safer for rescue operations. Sarah Levitt has more on the recovery efforts and on the potential victims.
Stone by stone, crews using cranes begin the delicate task of dismantling the building. The fire broke out early Thursday morning in a heritage building in Old Montreal. More than 100 firefighters worked to save residents in the building. For the building, it was a losing battle. Only the facade was left standing. 9 people were taken to hospital. 2 are still there with severe burns. Initially, it was thought 6 people were missing. Martin Guilbeault is the Montreal Fire Operations Chief.
Sadly, we have to announce that we're going to raise the amount of people missing. We're going to raise it to 7.
Police say they're missing, presumed dead. Among the victims, 18-year-old Charlie Lacroix and a friend. Robert Lacasse is her grandfather. He described her frantic call to 911 as the fire raged within the building. He says Lacroix called for help, saying there weren't any windows where they're staying and they couldn't get out. A second call to 911 was suddenly cut off. She probably died then or soon after, Lacasse said, overcome with emotion.
Charlie, c'était ma meilleure amie.
She was my best friend, Kellyanne Ségouin said of Lacroix.
Elle est tellement jeune, elle avait toute sa vie devant elle.
She had her whole life ahead of her. Others, like Alina Kuzmina and her husband, managed to get out just in time.
We started seeing the orange flames and the orange light from underneath the door and the sound of crackling fire. My husband grabbed a boot and smashed the window, and we got out through that.
Kuzmina says no fire alarms went off. Several people rented units in the building. Others, like Kuzmina, were staying in Airbnbs. Alain Vaillancourt is responsible for public security in Montreal.
There's only a certain sector here you can have Airbnbs on St. Catherine. This is not one of them.
The city says there's only so much that it can do and says it's been asking for resources from the province to combat illegal rentals for years. The owner of the heritage building wouldn't respond to calls from CBC. Now, Montreal's police arson squad will investigate to try and determine how this fire started. Sarah Levitt, CBC News, Montreal.
Communications have gone dark in India's northern state of Punjab. Officials imposed a statewide internet shutdown as part of an operation to track down and arrest a prominent separatist leader. Mariupol Singh belongs to a movement calling for the establishment of a sovereign Sikh state called Khalistan. The suspension of civil liberties in Punjab has prompted Canadian politicians of all stripes to express their concern. NDP leader Jagmeet Singh is urging Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to relay those concerns to his Indian counterpart. Many sub-Saharan Africans in Tunisia are returning home. Black migrants say they're experiencing increasing violence in the North African country, and they fear for their safety. It comes after a speech made by Tunisia's president blaming them for crimes. Idil Moussa reports.
Outside the Ivory Coast Embassy in Tunis, dozens of people wait with passports and paperwork in hand. They're trying desperately to get back home. Documented and undocumented migrants from sub-Saharan Africa say there's been a spike in violence against them in Tunisia, and it all has to do with comments made by the country's president. Last month, Kais Saied described black African migrants as bringing violence and crime to Tunisia and changing the country's demographics at a National Security Council meeting. He also called for urgent action by security forces to halt all illegal immigration. Ivory Coast national Barry Bialy Stefan says those comments led to people like him being attacked, and now they're fearful. Christian Kwangong is the president of an association representing sub-Saharan African students in Tunisia.
There were over a dozen cases of physical aggression with knives. We cannot even count the number of verbal assaults. The entire migrant community in Tunisia has been attacked.
Hundreds of Tunisians gathered in the capital to protest against the president's comments, some holding Black Lives Matter signs in solidarity with migrants, many of whom did not dare to join the action. Tunisia's foreign minister, meanwhile, denies Sayed's comments were racist.
This is a joke, and a bad joke, unfortunately.
And when pressed further by a CNN journalist, Minister Nabil Amar simply doubled down.
There has been a lot of misunderstandings and of people that want to raise this issue for other agendas, which are not ours at all. Our agenda is to protect those illegal migrants.
But critics of Tunisia's increasingly authoritarian leader say his real agenda is to divert attention away from issues facing Tunisians. Nduka Ntiono is with the Institute of African Studies at Carleton University in Ottawa.
in a country where there's poverty, where there's massive youth unemployment, then what you're simply doing is that you're giving them fuel and matches to attack people who otherwise are peace-loving people, some of them legitimate refugees who are fleeing crisis in their own countries.
The African Union issued a statement condemning Kais Saied's racialized hate speech against migrants. It also canceled a conference scheduled to happen this month in the country. The World Bank has also paused future work with Tunisia following the president's comments. Idil Musa, CBC News, Toronto.
Switzerland's biggest bank, UBS, is going to buy its troubled competitor, Credit Suisse. Even with a $50 billion infusion of cash from the Swiss National Bank, Credit Suisse customers have been heading for the exits, and its stock price has been falling. The UBS takeover was announced after a long day of talks between the banks, the regulators, and the Swiss government. The government had to offer tens of billions of francs in loans to make the takeover work. International regulators believe Credit Suisse failure would shake the global financial system. That's the sound of bombs hitting the city of Baghdad from the first U.S. airstrike in 2003. Tomorrow marks 20 years since the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq. While the initial invasion phase lasted just over a month, the whole conflict lasted more than 8 years, and the consequences endure. For more on the long-term effects and the lessons of the Iraq War, I spoke to Samuel Helfont. He's an assistant professor at the Naval War College in Rhode Island, but he spoke to us in a personal capacity and not on behalf of any part of the U.S. government. I started by asking him about his personal experience during the invasion 20 years ago.
So I was on active duty in the Navy. I was in U.S. Naval Intelligence. And I was on a ship just a few miles off the coast of Iraq, the USS Duluth. And this ship did amphibious warfare operations. So we had Marines, and we sent them in through Kuwait, and they fought into Iraq. And then we had some special forces that took over the oil infrastructure in southern Iraq, Navy SEALs and some Poles. And so we were the U.S. Navy ship that was closest to the Iraqi shore when the war was launched. So we saw all this, there was this shock and awe was the plan to send this massive barrage of missiles and strike aircraft, and it all came over our heads. So we just watched it, and we were listening to the artillery shells sort of rumbling on the shore. It was a strange sight. I was 22. I was quite young, and I wasn't quite sure what to make of it.
The war is roundly remembered, I think, as a political, military, humanitarian disaster. What do you think some of the mistakes were?
I think you could put the mistakes in probably two separate categories. One is just the category of policy, the decision whether or not to actually undertake a project like this, to invade Iraq, to launch the war itself was a mistake on the level of policy. And then there's another sort of level you could look at this through, which is the level of strategy. If you're going to carry out a war like this, how do you do it? And here there was a number of mistakes, really having to do with the troop levels and the resources that were needed to launch a war like this. And the Bush administration, really, it was Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, who just insisted on going in with a very light footprint, doing this on the cheap, not sucking up a lot of resources, not asking the American people to sort of foot the bill for something like this. The professional military sort of understood you needed several 100,000 troops, but we went in with less than 200,000, which turned out to be a disaster because the U.S. and its coalition partners couldn't keep the streets safe.
What were the consequences, most importantly for Iraq, but also for the region as a whole?
The consequences were quite significant. There was a brief moment there in the spring and early summer of 2003 when the Iraqis were, sort of ready to look to the future to see what this new phase was going to bring them. They were sort of happy to be done with Saddam Hussein. But when the United States took down the regime, it left a giant vacuum, and we had no way to fill that vacuum. And so instead, it was filled by extremists. I mean, there were moderates in Iraq, but in a situation like that, anybody who's willing to use force is going to have the upper hand. So a number of groups emerged, some from inside of Iraq, some came from outside of Iraq. really became a beacon for extremists all over the region to sort of rally and come to Iraq. And then for Iraq, it obviously tore the whole country apart with untold numbers. No one knows for sure, but certainly more than 100,000 Iraqis were killed in the violence that ensued afterwards.
And what do you think the lessons that have been learned are for the U.S.?
In some ways, there have been good lessons learned there, right? Taking over another country is not going to be easy. Even if the country even if the people in that country don't like their dictator, very few people are going to be accepting of a foreign military occupation, especially from people who know very little about the country they're invading, which was certainly the case with us. But there's also a sort of isolationist streak that is gaining traction in the United States, and which probably wouldn't be good for whatever's left of our liberal world order.
All right, Samuel, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for your thoughts on this.
Thanks for having me.
Samuel Helfont is an assistant professor at the Naval War College, and he spoke to us in a personal capacity. Millions of Canadians have an Air Miles card in their wallets. Lately, many have been asking if they should have cashed in their miles after rumors of bankruptcy at the program's parent company. Then, a potential savior, the announcement a Canadian bank wants to take over. But as Anis Haydari tells us, Air Miles' runway may not be entirely clear.
Earn free flights with the Air Miles program when you shop at Safeway.
1992, when Air Miles took off, promising rewards for travel at no cost.
I'm liking grocery shopping better all the time.
But those free points weren't free, at least not for the store. Air Miles makes its money by charging retailers a fee for every Air Mile point they give out. Fast forward 30 years later, and those fees aren't flowing in as much. And Air Miles' parent company is looking for protection from creditors.
If you were to ask me, would I have been surprised that Air Miles goes bankruptcy?
Ricky Jung is the founder of points website Prince of Travel.
With the trajectory that the program has been on over the past year or so, it was probably going to be a matter of time until something like this happened.
That downward trajectory was because Air Miles kept losing retailers. 2 years ago, they lost big players like Ontario Liquor Stores and Rona Hardware. Court filings show the company lost 10% of its revenue in 2020 and 2021. Then major grocery chains ditched Air Miles last year. Another 10% gone. After that, the company tried to renegotiate with Shell gas stations and the Bank of Montreal, ending up with deals that were financially worse for Air Miles. Now, BMO is trying to buy the whole Air Miles program out of bankruptcy.
I'm thinking there isn't too much they can do in terms of, gaining that nationwide glory that the program once had.
Patrick Soika runs Rewards Canada. His website was going to rank Air Miles a top 5 Canadian program, but dropped them after recent developments.
Until we see, the BMO signature on the dotted line saying that, we have officially bought Air Miles, until they're finalized, we don't know what's going to, will it be dissolved as part of the bankruptcy protection to pay off the creditors? We don't know that.
They probably got a pretty good deal for it.
Marketing professor Nicole Rourke says there's still potential here for the bank.
They just need to be a bit more creative. And it could be, instead of just a blender or a piece of luggage, it could be, coming up with some real financial incentives to encourage people to remain loyal to BMO.
For customers who really wanted that blender, Air Miles says reward points are safe at this point. The company initially agreed to an interview with CBC News, but then backed out. For its part, BMO says if this deal goes through, it wants to grow Air Miles and will strengthen what it offers Canadians. Bankruptcy hearings for Air Miles' parent company continue in a Texas court over the next few weeks. Anis Haydari, CBC News, Calgary.
You're listening to The World This Weekend on CBC Radio. I'm Stephanie Skandaris. Heading to the movies anytime soon? You could catch Scream 6 or the latest entry in the John Wick franchise, but there are also 3 distinctly Canadian movies hitting theaters across the country. They've been acclaimed by critics, but the question on the filmmakers' minds is, will anyone come out to see them? Tegan Beaudet reports.
마이클 조던 안 돼. That's the critical darling Rice Boy Sleeps, a drama centered on a Korean-Canadian boy and his mom set in suburban BC in the 90s. It's a personal story from Canadian filmmaker Anthony Shim.
And I made a deal with myself that if this thing doesn't work, it's time to get real and just move on and accept defeat. This wasn't meant for me, and I would be okay with that.
It did work. The film won Canada's biggest film award from the Toronto Film Critics Association, and it's up for 6 Canadian Screen Awards. Despite the success, it almost didn't get made.
The hardship, it was starting to outweigh the joy of pursuing my dreams. It was, especially when COVID hit. That's when I hit rock bottom.
Shim relied on his family's financial help to write the film, and now, despite its critical success, he remains cautious. And so is Chandler Levac. She made I Like Movies.
I want to be like a Canadian filmmaker.
What about Adam McGuane or David
Cronenberg. Oh my God.
It's a film about a teen working at a video store in Burlington, Ontario, who wants to make movies.
There's something about, you know, when you're like somewhere and you feel a bit estranged from other people in your community, and you find some kind of like movie that it feels like this kind of talisman for like a future self that you could be.
Levac was lucky enough to score a small grant from Telefilm to make her movie, but commercial success is hard to come by. In 2021, Canadian-made films accounted for just 5% of total box office at Canadian theaters. And that was a good year.
I think that it is a really dire time, and you look at the box office of like any Canadian movie and they're all huge flops, right?
Brother director Clement Virgo says despite the difficulties, the films have to be made, and not just for audiences.
There's so many amazing Canadian talent in front of the camera in this film, like Lamar Johnson, who's in The Last of Us, stars in the film. Kiana Madeira, another one of our fine young talents, is also starring in the film.
Virgo's film follows 2 Caribbean-Canadian brothers in the early 90s in Scarborough.
What's up, little brother? You good?
Yeah, I'm good.
He says his measure of success comes down to a tricky word: legacy.
You hope that your film lives on and is affected and affecting people beyond the moment.
Brother, Rice Boy Sleeps, and I Like Movies are playing in select theaters across Canada.
You should go to a party.
No. I like movies.
Tegan Beaudet, CBC News, Toronto.
In one of the world's most celebrated venues, the Hot Club of Portugal, patrons enjoy the smooth sounds of jazz music just like they have since 1948. The Lisbon institution is believed to be the oldest running jazz club in Europe, persevering despite dictatorships and disasters, hosting legends like Dexter Gordon and Dizzy Gillespie. This weekend, it celebrates its 75th anniversary, and as Alison Roberts tells us, local jazz lovers are settling into the small tables by the Hot Club's intimate cellar bar to reflect on its storied past.
Members of Lisbon's Hot Club discuss the state of jazz education in Portugal as part of this weekend's events. Free shows included one by the founder of the club's own jazz school, Zé Eduardo.
We are a beautiful audience. We are very proud to be in Denmark.
There was also talk of the history of the club. Current President Pedro Moreira recalls that it only opened to the public a couple of decades after its founding by Luís Vilas-Boas, the father of jazz in Portugal, under a conservative dictatorship.
It had to be a closed place, otherwise it could be too subversive. But he traveled a lot, and he knew all the musicians. He was friends with Duke Ellington and Count Basie, so he managed to bring many of them to Lisbon. They used to go to the club to play in jam sessions or just to hang out.
There are now other challenges. In 2009, a fire destroyed the original cellar bar, forcing the club to move to another building nearby. And in January, the City Hall said it must move out of what is an unsafe structure. So this weekend's festival took place elsewhere. The city hasn't found the club a permanent home yet, as it promised, but the president, himself a saxophonist and professor of jazz, says it's important to get things right.
It's not just the jazz club, because the Hot Club is a jazz club, but we have a jazz school with almost 400 students, a professional big band, and a possible future jazz museum.
The school's director, Gonçalo Marques, wants to involve more members of groups underrepresented on the Portuguese scene, such as those whose families come from former Portuguese colonies in Africa.
One challenge that we have is to find ways to have
have more scholarships. And another is to go to where those people are. It's just a matter of finding the funding.
That, he admits, may take a little time. For now, the club needs to find a new home. But the local jazz scene is undeniably thriving 75 years on.
That was freelance reporter Alison Roberts from Lisbon. We'll leave you with a little more of the jazz from the Hot Club of Portugal. You've been listening to The World This Weekend. I'm Stephanie Skandaris. Good night.